Hello, good evening for those who are in Berlin and good afternoon for those who are in Rio. On behalf of the conveners of this digital lecture series, Making Sense of the Post-COVID World, Continuities and Chains, I would like to warmly welcome you at this inaugural session of the series. The conveners are Mariana Cavalcanti and Mauricio Domingues from the Institute TIESP at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Wolfgang Knobel from the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, and I myself, Sergio Costa from Freie University Berlin. So this lecture series takes place in the framework of the Annelisa Mayer Research Award, conferred to Mauricio Domingues by the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And as the title suggests, we will explore in 8 lectures how the pandemic and our efforts to cope with the new situation have reconfigured our societies. Starting from different disciplinary and geographic perspectives, we aim at the end of the cycle of these lectures to build a complex picture of the effects of the pandemic for our lives, and particularly for the way we live together in difference and within inequalities. This implies investigating not only human-human relations, but also to explore changes in the relations between humans with plants, animals, and also artifacts and data. Post-corona in the series title does not imply, of course, that we believe that corona does not exist anymore. Post-corona here does not mean definitively after corona, but in similar constructions such as post-colonial or post-human. Post, in this case, means that the experiences accumulated in coping with corona have profoundly reshaped our societies, probably forever. Before I hand over to my colleague, Wolfgang Knobel, who will introduce Marion Fourcade, I would like to remark that you who are following this lecture via Zoom or YouTube can also actively participate in asking questions. For this, please use the chat function of the platforms. We will collect the questions and ask them. So thank you, and now I pass to you, Wolfgang, please, it's your turn.
Yes, it's a great honor and a pleasure, of course, to introduce Marion Fourcade, Professor of Sociology at the Department of Sociology, University of California, Berkeley. Marion started her career and her education in France, in Paris, obviously in the most prestigious institutions there. She did her BA and her MA there before she moved to Harvard and did her PhD there under the supervision of Orlando Patterson, Theda Skocpol, and Levi Schweber. And then after small minor steps, I would say, in other important institutions, she moved to Berkeley. First became an assistant professor, then an associate professor, and then since 2013, she became a full professor in the department. And of course, she had a very international career. Most recently, she was fellow at Princeton University at the Institute for Advanced Study, and she was and still is associate fellow at Max Po, this cooperation between the Kölner Max-Planck-Institut für Gesellschaftsforschung on the one side and Sciences Po in Paris on the other side. What is remarkable with respect to the career of Marion Fourcade is the fact that after her PhD in 2000, she obviously published an enormous amount of very important articles in many very prestigious journals on very different topics, to be sure, on voluntary associations in the American Sociological Review, on the transformation of economics, or on path towards neoliberalism in the American Journal of Sociology, or on moral views on market society in the Annual Review of Sociology. So that was obviously a sign that there was a kind of a rising star within American sociology, and that became clear when she published in 2009 a book I would like to advertise, although it was published already 13 years ago. I show it to you, a very, very important book, a comparative analysis of the development of the disciplines of economics in the United States, Britain, and France between 1890s and the 1990s. And the book is called Economists and Societies. And even afterwards, she continued with this outpouring of important articles, even in the German Kölner Zeitschrift für Soziologie und Sozialpsychologie, which was really important for the German audience as well, on das Unbehagen der Ordinalisierung. Most recently, I think it was in 2020. But Marion Fourcade is not only a scholar and an intellectual, she is also an organizer of the discipline of sociology and the social sciences. She has been, or still is, editorial board member of the European Journal of Sociology, of Theory and Society, of Contemporary Sociology, of Socioeconomic Review, and even of French Politics, Culture and Society, which basically shows that, you know, she is basically an international scholar within the social sciences. Her next book will be published together with Kieran Healy on the ordinal society. And since Marion is the winner of the Siegfried Landshut Prize 2021, awarded by our own institute, I have to say it very proudly, she will also publish a collection of her essays in German in autumn 2022 in our publishing house. But that is probably not the reason why we invited her. The real reason for the invitation in this lecture series is that Marion published together, co-edited together, as was already mentioned, together with Didier Pessin, a book which is called Pandemic Exposure, Economy and Society in the Time of Coronavirus. And this is, as Sergio Costa has already said, a very important and a very timely contribution. And that's why we are looking forward to her talk, a talk that is called The Great Online Migration, COVID-19 and the Virtualization of American Public Schools. Marion, we are really looking forward to your lecture, and thanks for joining our adventure.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang, for this incredibly generous introduction. And thanks, Sergio, Mauricio, and Wolfgang again for the invitation. I am really delighted to be part of this series. So, as Wolfgang mentioned, very recently, Didier Pessin and I published an edited volume. And that's a volume that sort of pulled together a series of contributions by a group of scholars who met for a year at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And when the pandemic hit, we were all working on topics related to the theme of economy and society. And when the pandemic hit, we decided to reorient the volume so that we would all look at what was happening in our respective area of research, you know, due to the pandemic. And at the time, I was working. I've been working for a while on the digital economy, the digitization of everything, right? And you know, that was an incredible opportunity for a topic like this. And I started with this idea that, you know, we were having this great online migration in practically everything. It turns out that it's impossible to study the great online migration of everything. So, you know, I ended up focusing my own contribution to the volume on the school system in the United States, and more specifically, actually, public schools in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live. And we did, with a group of graduate and undergraduate students, we did a number of interviews with school teachers, school officials, technology officers, and so on. So some of this material is going to come out, but much of what I'm going to present is really related to the chapter. So let me just share my screen. and I'll begin. So everywhere around the world, the public health policies associated with the COVID-19 pandemic have turned the economic world upside down. The consequences of disease, social distancing, halted physical mobility, suspended entire industries from, we've had transportation to tourism, restaurants, personal services, worship, entertainment, automobiles and aeronautics. Without governmental support, stores that relied on foot traffic would have tottered on the brink of bankruptcy, and many actually still do. And Berkeley is littered with stores that have closed. Other sectors had to profoundly reorganize their operations. Hospitals recentered their activities around the monomaniacal goal of treating wave after wave of coronavirus patients, while doctors expanded rapidly virtual office visits. Services that rely on in-person interactions and resources, and in the US, we can think of foster care, mental health, hospice, all of these were paralyzed for a while, unable really to meet citizens' basic needs. Meanwhile, all private and public workplaces have been forced to adapt to the abrupt rolling out of a sometimes long foretold virtuality. As you can see from this picture, working from home, was already represented a sizable percentage of the American labor force prior to the pandemic. In February 2020, it stood at about 15% of the workforce. But by April 2020, actually, it should be April, it had reached 50%. So 50% of the labor force was working from home. And even, more than a year later, in September 2021, we still had about 25% of full-time employees in the United States still work from home full-time. And then another 20% work from home about part-time. So what began as a serious disruption of daily life, the COVID pandemic, and work life, seemed in fact to have rewired the preferences of both workers and employers everywhere regarding work arrangements. Workers have come to value the flexibility of remote working, and we see that actually in work surveys. And employers, of course, value externalizing the cost of maintaining an office onto employees. And, of course, that's true of every sector. As societies grew fearful of contagion, digitality seemed to offer a reasonable substitute for everything. Now, of course, this great online migration was uneven, but what it implied, the renovation of build-up of digital infrastructures, the restructuring of supply chains, the reconfiguration of jobs, occupations, and all forms of social experience, all of that touched every country to some degree. And of course, that fix was thought to be temporary, but as I, showed with, as I'm showing with this data, today, in hindsight, digital settlements are beginning to look more permanent. So the question for us is, that transition felt like a brutal leap into uncertain modernity, but what will that modernity look like? Will it become the new normal? After all, the major fears have been overcome, new habits and ambitions have already been developed, and virtualization, increasingly looks like the normal way of life. And indeed, this lecture is a great example of this transition. Now, of course, the great online migration did not begin with COVID-19, but the pandemic dramatically accelerated the mutation of capitalism through digitality and the economic and political ascent of the technology industry and its leaders. For the select few in e-commerce, cloud computing, online advertising, cybersecurity, fintech, and more, the devastation brought about by the worldwide circulation of the virus was an unexpected boon. Online platforms whether established firms like the ones that I put here on the slide or digital upstarts, were quick to capitalize on the collapse of the offline economy and to press, massive digital reorganization onto every sector. The future they had been hoping to design had arrived years ahead of schedule. As the economy slumped and as people filed for unemployment and state budgets took a nosedive, tech stocks, tech investment and profits soared. And this is the figure that you can see here with the major tech firms, Facebook, Tesla, Amazon, Alphabet, which is Google, Microsoft, and Apple, all benefiting tremendously from the pandemic. Facing, the 5 biggest US companies, so their combined revenue grow by a fifth in 2020, and their combined market capitalization grew by a half. And then we see that also in what's happened with individuals. Between March 2020 and mid-July 2021, the collective wealth of America's 713 billionaires rose by more than $1.8 trillion, up nearly 60% in just 16 months. And indeed, much of the increase was driven by a small number of tech owner executives. And here I have but just, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but you can see, the very rapid growth of their wealth. Further down the income ladder, other social divisions have been amplified or reactivated as digital platforms started taking over the management of workforces. Long-term employees and brick and mortar businesses were fired and rehired as autonomous contractors with fewer job benefits and protections, much greater difficulty to unionize, and an increased exposure to competition from each other. Now, of course, the implications of this precipitous turn to digitality extend well beyond growing distributional inequalities. It has also hastened a profound transformation in lifestyles with more dramatic changes on the horizon. When the situation eventually improves, and it has already improved, many sectors could still be durably affected because newly formed habits will be keeping people away from street side outfits, think stores, cinemas, and restaurants, in favor of instead online entertainment, virtual reality, or highly concentrated delivery service industry. Work arrangements are the same. We saw the data, and again, Twitter, Square, many of the tech companies announced at the beginning of the pandemic that work from home arrangements could become permanent. And indeed, for certain segments of their workforce, they have. And of course, that in turn is affecting real estate markets. So, people here in the Bay Area, what we saw during the pandemic was, people deserting city centers and relocating to cheaper and more spacious suburbs and exurbs. I was actually at a cafe just last Saturday, and I overheard, a CEO who was saying, well, why would I pay people in the Bay Area when I can hire somebody elsewhere in the United States who will be much cheaper, both in terms of wage and in terms of benefits. And then he said, I could also, go to China. So, it was very clear that these reorderings are, may soon give way to much more disruptive movements, which have to do with this time the global telemigration of service labor to places around the world where the cost is lower. As Richard Baldwin and Richard Fourcade put it, quote, the digital transformation forced by COVID has radically lowered the barriers of trade in services, specifically to people sitting in one nation, yet working in offices in another nation. In other words, the pandemic could well offer, in miniature, a rehearsal for the already announced globotics upheaval, that's their word, that will see the online migration and associated with the globalization of many traditional offline workforces. Now, the great online migration has allowed the digital behemoths and the newcomers in the tech industry to expand their reach quickly into new populations. As people holed up at home, digital interfaces became the nearly obligatory point of passage for communication, economic exchange, and leisure. And social media and streaming and messaging platforms, including Netflix, YouTube, Facebook, exploded. But what happened also, and I think people are sort of sometimes less sensitive to that, is that the fog of the pandemic opened a narrow window for digital capitalism to reimagine government with more machine and fewer people, and for governments to learn from this laboratory of experiment, to use Adam Przeworski's phrase, that COVID-19 represented. So we've had already, seen that there's been a unique opportunity for governments to impose a new normal and firms of digital surveillance onto population and workforces, often with troubling implications for human rights, privacy, and the growth of corporate power. And of course, that, we've seen a great acceleration of the reform of many public operations in the name of modernization, efficiency, and increasingly the need to recoup the cost of recent digital investments, right? So if you invest in a public digital virtual infrastructure, then you might as well, take advantage of it once it's there. In May 2020, Andrew Cuomo, then governor of New York, signaled his willingness to follow the prescriptions of tech executives rather than policy experts in defining how technology can become more thoroughly integrated into post-COVID-19 public life. Schools were high on the agenda. Naomi Klein, who wrote this article that you see on the slide here, The Green New Deal, described the tenor of Cuomo's press conference as, quote, something resembling a pandemic shock doctrine, end quote. She continues, calling Bill Gates a visionary. Cuomo said the pandemic had created a moment in history when we can actually incorporate and advance Gates's ideas. All these buildings, all these physical classrooms, why? With all the technology you have, he asked, apparently rhetorically. That's the end of the quote from Naomi Klein. So unsurprisingly, that comment drew fire from the State Teachers Union, which countered that nothing will ever replace the personal relationship between a teacher and their students. Question is, does it really? Does nothing replace the relationship between a teacher and their students? In today's talk, I explore the cultural package of this great online migration that I've documented across various domains through the specific lens of the virtualization of American public education. The reason for this focus is that schools, which in the US are referred to as K through 12, so and that covers elementary and secondary schools. Schools stand at the center of controversies over the legitimacy of public closure mandates. They are also one of the sites where the online transition has been the most radical and the most problematic. Most significantly, schools' transformation during the pandemic reveals in stark fashion the latent dependency of basic public good provision on an increasingly complex field of technology vendors, all eager to disrupt and reinvent them. And so schools offer a particularly useful window to think about the pains, promises, and long-term implications of the COVID-19 driven leap into digitality. At the end of 2020, Some 320 million children worldwide were still locked out of schools. In the United States, where education policy is heavily decentralized, an estimated 62% of school districts started the 2020-2021 academic year virtually, with only 20% of the students in full traditional or in-person school. So that's the picture that you see here. The in-person is the, as you can see, is the solid line. The virtual is the smaller dotted line. And you can see that in August 2020, vast majority of school children were in virtual mode. So, and even by January 2021, only 39% were back in traditional school full-time. So millions of school children were forced to stay at home to comply with local COVID-19 mandates and with teachers' legitimate fears of contagion, often relayed by labor unions and often supported by local school boards. Education in the US is decentralized. School districts are run by locally, often elected boards. In San Francisco, close to where I live, public schools remained effectively closed for 18 months. So, when we did interviews with my student, David Joseph Gottheiner, we talked to, as I said, school officials in the Bay Area. And, the first thing that came out in our interviews was this enormous shock of having to adapt very quickly. So here's a quote, for instance. It was like, holy crap, what are we doing? We're going to move the show over to computer now. I mean, big bureaucratic organizations like school districts are not, it meant they're not nimble, right? They are aircraft carriers. They do not turn on a dime and say, okay, great, we're going to do this now. Everybody do this. So it was very, very anxiety producing and very uncertain. And of course you had, that's for the administrators, but you can imagine for school teachers, particularly those who were not using technology very much before. We have lots of evidence of this, just utter fear and anxiety. And in fact, and there was another fear. In the early weeks of the pandemic, there were worries that the physical infrastructure of the internet would actually not be able to withstand the charge. Now, it turns out that these concerns were misguided. Rather than bringing the internet's infrastructure to its knees, the great online migration has actually made it more ubiquitous and more formidable. Indeed, living outside of technology's orbit has become even more inconceivable and terribly marginalizing than before the pandemic. The online exodus has brought into sharp relief the relevance of the digital divide to inclusion and basic social rights, work, education, the distribution of income support, everything, had to move online. And so the inability of poor populations, both urban and rural, to access the necessities of digital life became increasingly visible and increasingly unacceptable. The digital solutions that were aggressively peddled by both industry power players and opportunistic upstarts, could then fit into an already well-established narrative about technology as a solution to exclusion and marginality. And, you saw lots of reports, that was, the question of digital inclusion was an enormous concern of government, international organizations, and so on. And nowhere was this concern, of course, more, acute than with respect to schools. So this is here, you can see, reports, this is the World Economic Forum here, using a survey in the United States, and you can see that the way that digital technology is distributed puts really the poor children behind. You can see that higher income households are much more likely to have, not only to have, but to be able to use a computer, because sometimes there's only one computer in the family. And who's going to get it? Is it the parent who has to work online? Is it the kid who has to go to school? That difference became a major concern of policymakers. And in the United States, and in the school context, some of this was solved in part by governments making massive investments in Wi-Fi and computing equipment, providing devices to schools. Philanthropy intervened, particularly tech philanthropy. So Twitter's, at the time CEO, not anymore, not anything really. Jack Dorsey, gave $10 million to Oakland public schools. Google, Microsoft, and so on provided also devices for free, especially in poor school districts. So here, this is, and then schools themselves, started to basically use the devices that they had, physically at the school, and just sending them home with the kids. So here's an example from an administrator in a local school district in the Bay Area, who said, and our high school, which is which has about 3,000. Sorry, I apologize. The quote is not written very well. 3,600 students was ready take home one-on-one with Chromebooks, so they could pivot to distance learning without really any work. For elementary and middle school, this meant we had to send home about 8,000 Chromebooks. So that literally we were going into classrooms, dismantling Chromebook carts, basically to every student that didn't have access to a computer at home. Now, while the consequences of distance learning dragging on are potentially serious for all pupils, those with poor internet access, inexistent hardware, and digitally unskilled parents actually struggle much more. Many students in traditionally vulnerable categories, so the homeless, foster children, non-English mother tongue speakers, and of course, low-income families, so their absenteeism rates go up, or simply many actually vanished from the school rolls. Here you can see data from a study that McKinsey did, the consulting firm did at the, sort of towards the middle of the pandemic. And what you can see is that, one of the paradoxes is actually, even though, online education is more challenging for poor students are unlikely, are more exposed to it, so they're much more likely to be learning remotely in the United States. So here, this is, this is racial data rather than class data, but it in part, it, of course, as you know well, it overlaps with class. And you can see that, for instance, about 70% of Black and Hispanic students during the pandemic, at the higher point of the pandemic, were learning remotely, compared with less than 50% of white students who were mostly in-person schools. And that's partly due to the urban-rural divide. Urban schools were more likely to be closed. Not only that, but even when they were, they were also much less likely to have access live to teachers. So when they learned online, it was not necessarily with a teacher behind the screen. They were essentially learning from a canned program. I mean, not all the time, obviously, but they were more likely to not have access to a live teacher, about 2 to 3 times more than white students. So, you know, and what's interesting is that ambivalence, you know, in spite of what we know and the fact that, you know, these poor families and particularly in the US minorities, racial minority families, you know, in spite of the fact that they bore the burden of the school closing, ambivalence towards school reopening consistently ran high among these families. So in a national survey that was done, you know, during the pandemic by the University of South California, only 14% of Black parents, but 46% of non-Hispanic white parents and 29% of Hispanic parents expressed a preference for in-person only education. So again, an enormous diffidence towards in-person education among racial minorities. And these figures are in fact very much consistent with findings from parent surveys and press reports from around the country, as well as my own analysis with my student David Joseph Gottheiner of school board meetings in various cities in the county of Alameda in California. As sociologist Keanga Yamata-Taylor pointed out in an article in the New Yorker, the aversion of poor, often non-white families to sending their children back to school builds on a long history of distrust and anger toward institutions that have often served communities of color poorly, as well, of course, as on their own awareness that the pandemic has taken a heavier toll on them. And that aversion has persisted even after repeated reassurances by public authorities about the safety of schools and a national moral panic over the severe and well-documented learning losses and mental health challenges now faced by children who have been taken out of school. Here I'm just giving you a sense of, you know, what it might mean for a kid who is in school, but chooses to be in the virtual academy. That is, you know, so today, I should mention that today, school districts have reopened largely, but they have maintained what they call a virtual academy. It existed before, essentially for children who were sick, but now, you know, the virtual academy is seen as a sort of choice that some school districts will offer to families, you know, in lieu of in-person education. And what we did interview people to ask them, you know, how does it work? So here's an example of this one virtual academy. They're not all that way, but, you know, it gives you a sense of, you know, where it could go. The virtual academy, it's all based on the software called Continuities, and it's all paced with self-grading things. The simplest level is just self-running curriculum that somebody presses play. So he comes in the morning, presses play, and the curriculum just rolls. I'm finding that as an actual teacher, it's hard to just do that, just come in and press the play button and do nothing else. And I've been in email chains where people are like, hey, I'm trying to teach kids, but it's really wonky, because then the kids are like, hey, why are you bothering teaching me? I'm like busy trying to get my online work done, you know? So the teacher is, you know, is there behind the screen, you know, the curriculum is self-running, the kids are interacting with automated exercises and so on. The teacher is just there to verify that they do their work, but not really supporting or interacting with them. Meanwhile, of course, what we saw during the pandemic is that the better off, predominantly white children experienced the pandemic differently. They were not only less exposed to virus contagion, but their parents were also more likely to pressure local school boards to design hybrid solutions or resume normal education altogether. And where school closures were prolonged, as in much of California, the most privileged in this group had alternative solutions to work with. from moving to second homes in rural areas, to in-person instructions in private schools, to homeschooling pods relying on private tutors and teams of educated parents. Wealthy families, in other words, reverted to familiar domestic and commercial strategies that were somewhat reminiscent of how the children of social elites were educated prior to the advent of mass education. Finally, private schools and privately operated charter schools, including many evangelical schools, have faced a surge in enrollments. And many of these are, the privately operated charter schools, many of them are actually virtual schools. And so various types of virtual schools, both the charter schools and the for-profit virtual schools, instructional platforms, online tutoring services seem to have benefited from this exodus. And as students, both rich and poor, withdrew or transferred to other systems, public school enrollments dropped, threatening to defund publication for years to come. This is recent data from California, and you can see the very rapid drop, the 2 years in a row, 2019, 2020, and 2020, 2021. And in fact, 2021 and 2022 is also, a very dramatic drop. The school systems are seeing a retreat of children, and the effect is particularly noticeable in the entry grades, with kindergarten enrollments dropping in the United States by 9.3% nationally between the 2019-2020 school years and the 2020-2021 school year, and dropping even more in low-income neighborhoods. It dropped by 14%. What we have, of course, is a transformation of the relationship of all families to public education, and in particular of low-income families and families from racial minorities. Okay, so what the other thing that we are seeing is, of course, transferring to transforming to online platforms was a challenge, not simply for schools, for families, and so on, but for teachers as well. Of course, the most impacted districts were also the least resources, and so the least likely to be able to invest. For many educators, transitioning to online teaching was anything but natural. The digitally illiterate had no choice but to adapt on the fly, often with little training, little guarantee of privacy, and little consideration for personal circumstances, such as their family responsibilities. Some organizations, and here, we looked at the California Teachers Association, in fact, tried to stem the transition to remote instruction initially. They were worried about, the fact that parents, administrators, supervisors, and possibly the larger public would be invited into their classrooms. They were also worried about student screen fatigue, the poor demonstrated effectiveness of online education, and the need to preserve the confidentiality of classroom interactions. So initially, there were strong arguments against distance learning, which had been the arguments against distance learning all along before the pandemic. But of course, as soon as the pandemic hit, that was the only possibilities. There were, in some American cities, there were some teachers initially who refused both online learning and in-person online learning on account of what I just mentioned, and then in-person on account of the virus. But of course, that's an unsolvable dilemma if you're a teacher. You just can't work. And so, by and large, these resistances did not last. Teachers' unions came to embrace virtualization as the lesser evil, given the continued risk of virus exposure. And so the social conflicts that we might have expected over virtualization, which have always been the conflicts about sort of, in any profession really, fears about de-skilling, job losses, data-driven surveillance, all of that actually did not happen at the moment of the pandemic, or they were muted or momentarily deferred. But what we're seeing now, and it's not right, there are surveys that query teachers about their intentions for the future, and the number of teachers who state that they want to exit the profession has increased quite dramatically, even though this has not yet been followed by action. So teacher attrition rates haven't changed yet in the US, but all the associations, this is here the National Education Association, are sort of raising alarm bells about sort of the fact that people don't want to teach anymore in this context, and that's partly due to sort of the the trauma of the transition. To be sure, some did some did very well during that transition, and we've interviewed people who were in that position, but that was certainly not universal. Okay, so COVID-19 has accelerated an ongoing structural transformation, and many publication officials today feel that there will be no going back from remote and hybrid learning. In San Antonio, Texas, the superintendent vowed to make hybrid education permanent. I've mentioned that many cities today, many school districts are setting up virtual academies so that they can offer to any student the option of taking, of being educated online. A national survey of American school districts found that about 2 in 10 districts have already adopted, plan to adopt, or are considering adopting virtual schools as part of their district portfolio after the end of the pandemic. Now, some do it out of necessity to meet a growing demand from families, and I've explained why this demand is high. Some do it to meet a shortage or an expected shortage of teachers, teachers discouraged by the pandemic. And then others see a promise of cost reduction, a promise of economies of scales and flexibilities. So what we're seeing is that, we're seeing virtual academies, educational startups, popping up everywhere to serve these ambitions. And they are backed by a rush of venture capital. As I mentioned, enrollments in virtual charter schools have exploded. And, with all of that, digital educational capitalism is on the march. Now, the what Singer calls the Googlification of the classroom was already far along before COVID-19, with the Bay Area company dominating both the provision of hardware with these, cheap computers outfitted with Google's Chrome operating system called the Chromebooks. And Google was also providing cloud software specific to educational use, which is called Google Education. And you can see here, that with the pandemic, the Chromebooks were doing fine, before, but then suddenly, they took off, and the global shipment of these computers specifically outfitted with Google software just exploded. So the pandemic has truly transformed education into a seller's market, and it has acted as a catalyst for an emergent network of financial investors eager to frame EdTech as the next digital cash cow. Scrambling and resource-starved school districts found themselves harassed by EdTech carpetbaggers selling untested tools. Following a well-established model in tech, education startups offer basic apps for free to generate interest and word-of-mouth virality. So here's an example of these two these two apps that are widely used in American school districts, CISO and Class Dojo. And you can see they're both free. The teachers can download them for free, direct their students to download. Very often, actually, the products are targeted directly to kids or to teachers or to parents, in fact, bypassing the public administrations, the public institutions that govern the schools. And once the teachers have adopted these tools, then the school itself, if it wants to adopt a school-wide option, the school might face a steep pricing schedule. So this is an example, and some of these tools are all-encompassing and resemble social media platforms. The app CISO, popular in elementary schools, is thoroughly gamified, for instance. With users, teachers, students, parents encouraged to upload content, audio, voice, video, homework, lessons, and so on through the app. Everybody's encouraged to like and comment on the child's work and possibly share it with the rest of the class once the teacher has consented. And then if you want additional features, that requires a subscription. So, we saw that in our interviews, we had people saying, well, so Google for Education used to be free for school districts. And then Google, last year decided to, to move to a fee-based schedule for school districts. And, of course, once the district, that happened once the district had become committed to this particular product. And so here's a quote where the person is saying, we've realized that it really would end up being worth paying whatever, even the bottom tier of the paid version of Google to keep what we have than to move to Apple and lose all of this, or move to Microsoft and all of this. You cannot, easily move to another learning management platform. And so, it's sort of a bait and then switch policy. Now, in the edtech sector, like in the rest of the tech industry, there's a history of using data as an invisible currency. Before the passage of federal and state data privacy laws, data could be bargained away to vendors without real democratic oversight. And in fact, many of the more restrictive policies implemented after the mid-2010 still contain significant loopholes. And in many states, it is schools rather than tech companies that are responsible for establishing privacy protocols. But of course, they are not very well equipped to do that. COVID-19 sent America's nearly 40,000 school districts scrambling to organize that sort of mission and try to figure out, if the apps that they were using were actually complying with state and federal and local, regulations. Most found that they did not have the expertise nor the resources to survey the vast offering of online services, let alone negotiate individualized data privacy agreements with providers. And as I said, often it's very hard for schools to figure out what's happening because tech companies often target teachers directly, who then ask students to sign up for new apps in an ad hoc manner. And of course, not only is such decentralized diffusion inherently difficult to control, but it habituates both children, including very young children, and parents to a medium that often provides a gateway into social media. So, the question is, what's happening with all the data that can be collected, not simply during the school sessions, but also once, the children are sort of browsing outside of the session, so a much broader range of online behavior may suddenly become accessible to companies, surveilled, analyzed, and of course, monetized. In fact, the tech sector has increasingly reframed data production as an analytical solution to increase the legibility of school activities to students, parents, teachers, and administrators. The new generation of EdTech proposes flashy data dashboards with analytics designed to disaggregate the learning and teaching processes into easily commensurable and quantifiable bits: time on site, response to assignments, instructor comments, scores and grades, and much more. By encouraging audiences to buy into the business in the name of convenience, transparency, or productivity, EdTech companies legitimate their own data collection processes and normalize an infrastructure of generalized data surveillance. And you can see how these tools can be used also to surveil teachers and to do essentially labor management within schools. Now, the fact is that once unleashed, these kinds of dynamics take a life of their own, and the consequences are profound. The collection and use of data generated through online learning is largely unregulated, and no one knows for sure what is retained, for what purpose, and what it is worth. Today, all organizations, in fact, assume that they should sweep up as much as they can. As a matter of course, this is something that Kieran Ely and I have called the data imperative that applies to all organizations. And then finally, in addition to a dizzying array of startups, the sector of EdTech is teeming with financial actors that specialize in the production of valuation claims about the EdTech field and make it their business to render this field intelligible and attractive to investors, and that for venture capitalists and asset managers. So there's this agency called Holon HQ, founded in 2018. That's the agency that sort of follows this sort of global online global education market, and it has predicted that this market will reach $10 trillion by 2030. And this plays a very important role in focusing sort of the discourse of the sector and reframing education as essentially a profit-making monetary opportunity. To say that that wasn't the case before, well, of course it was. There was huge market for textbooks and all kinds of services, but this is happening in the context of this new tech boom. According to financial analysts in the sector, the COVID-19 related school closures and then its aftermath dramatically boosted predictions of future market growth for the EdTech sector, leading to the creation now of global exchange traded funds designed specifically to support companies in the business of transforming education. So you're seeing that being financialized as well. And the work of, I should give a shout out here to the work of Ben Williamson, who's definitely one of the most remarkable scholars in that area. And he's talked about that. In these imaginaries of capital, what was once the quintessential public good has already been remade into a bundle of assets yielding future streams of income. And of course, that process, and I think it's important, it's substantive as much as it is infrastructural. So it's not simply the delivery of education that is being transformed and privatized, but it is also its content and its philosophy. So it's, what's being transformed is also, how, what should be taught, how it should be taught, and so on and so forth. We've seen, Will Davis, for instance, has written a very interesting piece about sort of encountering grading by an algorithm. So we're seeing a number of tasks that are being, now reframed by the new technological possibilities. Okay, so to conclude, where does this leave us? I think COVID clearly was a boon for the tech industry. It sharply accelerated the inexorable digitization of all industries. It invited massive streams of state and private capital in a rush to bring about the digital future sooner than expected, while nearly obliterating any social resistance to virtuality. In the domain of education, a return to the status quo ante looks unlikely. Whatever misgivings parents, students, and teachers may have had, the customizability and auditability of e-learning may appeal to some populations, especially in the United States, where children's education is often seen as a matter of family or personal discretion, and where inequalities in resources between schools in wealthy and poor neighborhoods are properly outrageous. Facing that, virtuality, comes to be equated with freedom and with, a palliative for, these kinds of inequalities between school districts. So the bottom-up movement of, endorsing virtualization is probably as important as the top-down one. And the top-down movement is, of course, the fact that the economies of scale and possibly lucrative relations with industry may actually seduce policymakers, administrators, and some teachers, especially in cash-strapped districts. So as an institution, the public school today is in flux in the United States, I should say, both because the digital disruptors are looking to dissolve it into technology in the name of efficiency and modernity, and because part of the public concurs in the name of choice. So what we are seeing is not simply a process of virtualization, as in my original title, but really one of platformization. The redefinition of what going to school means, what learning and teaching in school is about, often on terms that are defined by large digital platforms and tech startups. Through these material and cultural upheavals, what's at stake is not simply a shift to a new technological medium. It is rather the whole governance of education as an institution. And so I'd like to end up by posing this question of, that really what's at play here is the very notion of education as a public good, and the very notion of a universal public good that is at play. And perhaps, what we're seeing is an anticipation of some of the really important political struggles that we will see developing in the 21st century. So I'll just stop here, and thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to your questions.
Yes, Marion, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I think we will have a lot of questions and a lot of comments, but maybe I would just go to one or two questions which already came up, which point to a kind of clarification. And the questions are basically those. Could you give us a more comprehensive explanation why, for example, there was this drop of enrollment within poorer kids? What is the background here? And the second question was, what is basically the explanation that Black students and Black pupils didn't have as much remote sessions as other ones?
So the data...
No, the other way around, did have more likely remote sessions than the other ones.
Yes. So on that question, they were more likely to be in school districts that closed. So they particularly large cities, large urban environments. So because of, so it's partly due to sort of the distribution of the Black population across the territory. The rural school districts were much less likely to close, but they tend to be more white. And so we've seen that, because of that, almost mechanically, children of racial minorities, and particularly Black children, were more likely to learn online rather than in person. But even when the schools reopened, that's the point I was trying to make, even when the schools reopened, these families, tended to be less willing to send their children back, partly because the pandemic, of course, is still not over. And as we know, children in the United States, for instance, the mortality of Black and Hispanic families is much, much higher than the mortalities, of Black people to COVID, much higher than white people. And so, partly, it's due to the fact that they are well aware of that the risks tend to be higher for them. But also, there is a certain defiance, almost cultural defiance against public education that we are increasingly seeing among these families. And, of course, there's a long history of public education, not treating these populations very well. Part of the fact that public education is organized on such a decentralized basis in the US means that, urban minority-based schools are much, much less well resourced than their white counterparts, and so on. So, and even, for instance, in Oakland, for instance, even you took some public schools in, in majority white districts versus public school in majority Black school districts. You may have had, different policies, with the white parents putting a lot more pressure to, to send the kids back to school, and the minority parents actually putting pressure for the school not to reopen. And so that's sort of one of the real paradox. And I see there's a question about, our children, so I forget what your first question was, but I think it's about, children not being—
enrollment of
the enrollment
population.
So where do they go? That's a bit of the mystery, where do they go? So, a lot of children are being pulled from the school system. So I think what's happening is, and we are waiting for the sort of the new data to come in actually any moment now. Partly you have an escape at the top. So, wealthy families are sort of sending their kids to private schools, sort of leaving the public school system altogether. But the poor families, some have moved to homeschooling, some have moved to and homeschooling with sort of sometimes virtual schools, so these virtual schools, they can be virtual charter schools, or they can be virtual nonprofit schools, or they can be virtual for-profit schools. But essentially, they tend to move. And again, this is a small minority, but, it is sufficient to sort of give you pause and say, what is going to happen in the long run, right? So you're seeing this exodus, I think, at sort of both ends of the income scale, for very different reasons. Yeah.
Thanks, Marion, for this clarification. There's a question by Sergio.
Yes, thank you so much, Marion. It's just to do justice to some participants who sent questions previously. So a lot of questions, but I will try to summarize in 2 blocks of questions. The first one concerns inequalities at 2 levels, of the level of schools. And I read a part of the question. In terms of explaining the inequality in education, you affirm that white and wealthy families would move to rural areas to in-person instruction in private schools and hire private tutors. But before the pandemic, white elite families also sent their children to private schools, hire tutors for their children, or purchase expensive online education resources. To what extent does this affect them differently than before and now and before the pandemic? So it's a sort of skepsis that really profound changes here. Also, perhaps a second question also connected to these ambivalences of inequalities. So the sort of outsourcing of labor to other regions through digitalization actually is seen by some participants as a sort of opportunity for increasing upward mobility for developing countries. In that way, that people working in developing countries or unemployed there, for them are some precarious occupations in the global north actually an opportunity. So, and the question would be, I read then the question here from the participant, while you're researching inequality in sociological investigation, how can we derive cross-national models and conclusions while accounting for the duality of consequences of digital migration? So a quite complex question. Perhaps I stop here. There are two questions more from the participants, but I can put the question in the second round.
Thank you very much. Yes. So on the first question about, what happened with white family and is this really a break? Of course, white families were more likely prior to the pandemic to send their kids to private school and to, make use of these other resources and all of that. There's no question about that. But there had been a movement, and you could see that in the California data. I mean, I can show it again. But there had been a movement of sort of growing enrollment in public schools. So let me see. Where is it? Oh, wait, there it is. Sorry. So you can see, in the, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there's massive, there's a sort of growth of enrollment in schools. And this is in part, during the 70s and 80s, the US is very particular, of course, related to that. And the white flight from particularly urban schools has been well documented during the 70s and 80s, partly following programs of sort of school integration and busing. And then, but by the 2000, we had seen a sort of a reversal in part of that movement. And what we're seeing during the pandemic is again, sort of an exodus with people sort of, falling back on sort of these more, these other strategies of sort of pulling their kids out of the public school system. So, a lot of private schools, including, confessional schools, Catholic schools, and all of that have done, quite well, much better during the pandemic than, than public schools. So that's, again, we're still waiting to see, whether this is going to be permanent or not. It's still very early to tell. And as I said, national data is, for the last year is, not going to come out until about a month from now. But, this is what seems to be happening. In terms of sort of global inequalities, you're absolutely right. What is sort of, taking work away from people in the United States is giving work somewhere else. And so what you might see is an increase in inequalities domestically in the US, but, a shrinking of inequalities internationally between countries where, and that sort of are being lifted through this great online migration. And it's not sort of it's not a moral judgment on my part. And I'm just sort of stating, well, this is what we are seeing. And indeed, I think all of us at this point, are probably participating in this. I have my Pilates instructor in Spain. I have classes twice a week, but that person is in Spain because I happen to like her, and so this is sort of these new things that are happening, and of course we're seeing more and more of that. Yes.
Yes, thanks, Mario. That already covers, I think, the second question in the chat. I will pick the first question in the chat before I hand over to Maurice Dominguez and Mariana Cavalcanti. And the question focuses on the long-term consequences for higher education in K-12 for this generation. I mean, that there is short that there are short changes, that's no doubt, but what do you think, that's the question, with respect to a longer time period for higher education? Do you have any guesses here?
So the kids who have gone through, online education as elementary and secondary school students, what will happen to them in higher education? I think we all, we're educators here, presumably most of us, and I think we're seeing some of that already. I mean, I am facing this with my own class. I realize that people don't know how to write, an exam anymore because they've been doing it online. So just administering like an in-class written exam, without sort of the medium of a computer is becoming, is becoming difficult. So that's one small consequence that you can think about. But I think, the more fundamental question is that, people are going to be, and already are, evaluated in sort of a different way. So the way that you get into university, the way you get, you get to progress and so on, increasingly, these sort of indicators that come from the analytics of whatever tech platform, schools are using, once the data is there, what we know is that, companies, organizations, are trying to find uses for it. And I think it is not impossible that some of this will transfer and play a determining role in the way that people work in higher education. And then, finally, the processes are very similar there, and possibly even more, especially in the United States, where a lot of higher education is, is very expensive and making a lot of, it's about, universities make a lot of money. And so you could have you could have a sort of a bifurcated outcomes with some sort of winners at this game, your famous universities and so on, doing quite well because they are now able to reach a much, much larger population. Right. And then, the other ones that are sort of squeezed out because, there's a lot of stuff that is available for free or for a very cheap price and so on. So that's one, that's one possibility. I mean, what we're seeing is, the University, for instance, of California at Berkeley is very adamant that, they want students to be in person on campus. But what we're seeing is that we are having these bottom-up pressures from students who, in spite of the fact that they got into UC Berkeley, they want, to have the possibility of learning online because, for instance, they cannot afford rent in the Bay Area. It's just too expensive. And so they would rather, stay in a place that's much cheaper and, have access to a Berkeley education through this sort of different channel. And so that is, and that's, those pressures are very real and they're very much there. And I don't think that, universities will, I think at some point universities will just embrace the whole thing.
Thanks, Marion. Mauricio.
Marion, thank you very much for your talk. Wonderful in terms of competent form, so clear. But I have a question, which is, it has to do with my perplexity, because the thing I have is not living through disorganized modernity. We are really living now through chaotic modernity. It's very difficult to make sense of the world right now. So many things are happening. And you showed us exactly in what regard: digitalization, delocalization, the power of this huge platform, capitalist companies, but also educational companies which are giants, which work globally. But there is an issue I like to raise with you, because it's, on the other hand, for instance, it's also the first chapter of the book you have edited. Lots of people, myself included, speak about a sort of comeback of the state now. And I wonder how you would relate this sort of tendencies or trends or process, I don't know exactly how to define them yet, that you are describing to what's happening to the state. If you look at what Cuomo tried in New York, it was pretty opposite. It seemed to deliver education to these big companies, right? But elsewhere, in other areas, you see the state being strengthened and having policies of at least the possibility of intervening more in society. So I would like to hear a bit about that. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Mauricio. Well, I mean, you're right. Of course, it's a little too early to sort of pass judgment and say this is where it's going to go. You know, I think we don't know. One possible transformation is that this, you know, the state will still want to control this process, and indeed. So what's happening in the US is not universal by any stretch of the imagination. So for instance, France was, the French government wants to have its own platform. It has to come from the Ministry of Education and not, not from the private companies. So that's one possibility, is that the process will happen, but sort of still, directed from sort of above. We are seeing in the US, so for instance, with respect to the tech industry, we've seen a lot more willingness of the state to take on that industry. So there's major antitrust actions against Google, against Facebook, against Amazon, that are brewing or already started. So that's, there's certainly a willingness there, but especially for education, I am not very optimistic, precisely because of the structure of education in the United States, precisely because it is already a very heavily decentralized institution, right? The Department of Education, the Federal Department of Education is of course important, but really the major decisions, are taken by school districts and school boards, and school boards are elected. So there's also a politics around this that, has been extremely vicious in the recent few months, with people opposing not only the mask mandates in schools, but also, what's being taught, and, so increasing assertiveness of parents. So this whole idea of choice, which was already there, with the development of the charter school movements in the US, has been really, I think, during the pandemic, has come to a head, and you're seeing, I think, a major development of that sort of idea. And now, with the actual technical possibility of implementing it, right, of making education a matter of individual choice. And I think that possibility wasn't really there before in the same way. It was so much harder to implement that. But in today's world, you can. So I don't want to, comment, because the question of what this, what's happening to the state with digitization is a huge one. I've actually written a paper about it. If you're interested, it's called Learning Like a State, which is sort of a theorization of what's happening to the state in the era of digitization. But, with respect to education, as I said, I am not super, in this country, I am not very, very hopeful.
Before I hand over to Mariana Cavalcanti, maybe your last answer is already a kind of an answer to the question posed in the chat, which says, well, education always has been, or public education always has been, a kind of an equalizing machine with respect to social structure. And what you are saying, if I understand you correctly, is that it might be the case that this equalizing mechanism will be reduced more and more in countries such as the United States, where education has been already privatized, but it might be a little bit different in other countries where the state or the central state has a stronger hand on it.
I think that's right. And remember, it's not simply that education is an equalizing machine. It is also that it is an integrating machine, right? It is a culturally integrating machine where, people go through this as a part of their, part of their socialization, and it's, roughly supposed to be similar. And sort of this idea of, that it could become sort of disaggregated and fragmented is also, not simply a concern in terms of perhaps mobility and, will sort of the kids who have been educated through virtual schools, will they have learned the same way? Will they be able to do as well as their peers who are still in person and so on? We don't know yet. I mean, what we know is during the pandemic, it was not very hopeful. It was pretty dispiriting, actually. Kids fell behind, and kids from, who had been less in person, fell further behind. Kids from racial minorities fell further behind. So inequalities have actually increased in the US. Racial achievement gaps have increased during the pandemic. But it's also, it's also a cultural concern. And I think that, to me, that's in terms of, if you think in sort of Durkheimian terms, I think we should be worried about sort of the lack of sort of common ground. And education was one of the few, public education was one of the few institutions that sort of provided that common ground. Of course, that's truer in countries that had a more centralized system, like France. But even in the US, I think it did matter.
Thanks so much. Mariana Cavalcanti.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Marion, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I know that not all the data is in and that it's ongoing from what you've said. But I'd like to ask you about something that I've been thinking about ever since I picked up the book itself, that has to do with the multiple temporalities that we can look at, the idea of the pandemic exposures. And so you explicitly mentioned, right, the Great Migration, when Blacks from the rural South throughout the 20th century migrated to cities in America in the North, right? And that was a huge transformation in terms of social structure. And it was also a huge transformation in terms of urban infrastructure and the ways in which inequalities played out from then onwards, right? So departing from this explicit mention, I'm wondering if there's also an implicit comparison between these two migrations that you're talking about, right? So what does the urban migration from the South to the North have, how does thinking of in those terms, or comparing what's going on right now to what happened throughout the 20th century, what can we get from that? Because I have a sense that it's not there by chance, right? I'd love to hear.
No, it's not there by chance, but I felt actually that it was too speculative for me to actually write.
Right. That's what I thought.
Yeah,
speculate.
Yeah, exactly. But if you follow what I just said as an answer to the previous question, yes, there is a possibility that we would have a similar process where, with a bifurcated kind of education, with, again, so people moving online with different kinds of services. So the more, repetitive canned, less interactive forms of virtuality, perhaps serving certain populations more, possibly racial minorities. And, that's one possibility, unless there's a massive investment like there was in the 60s and 70s in public housing and so on by the state. We could see actually that this, this great online migration of schools, which, for some really appears like an opportunity to reinvent a really broken education system. I don't want to minimize that. That's part of the attraction, and that's part of why, you know, a lot of scholars of education are actually seeing this as a, you know, as a place of hope, right? Mm-hmm. But you know, if we know anything about history, is that these inequalities have a tendency to reproduce themselves wherever, you know, people go. And so I wouldn't be surprised that it, you know, and I think we need to be aware that this is what's facing us, and we need to, you know, perhaps do our best so that it doesn't happen. So that's, you know, that, yeah, there is a very clear inspiration, but I am, until I have more of the data and I see more of this, you know, I don't want to actually play too much on it, with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. The next question goes to Sergio Costa, who is also responsible for closing the class. I have no clue how that works at your institution. So, Sergio.
Yes, we are almost running out of time, but I think perhaps two last questions, because we had a lot of questions concerning internet governance. So the participants were quite impressed by the idea of this education as seller's market. And the question is how to avoid this kind of situation. What kind of actors can be, it's really a realistic possibility to create an arrangement in which civil society, state, and big tech companies participate in reorganizing the internet governance and so on. What are your ideas about this sort of regulation by law or by new forms of arrangement? So this is a sort of summary of different questions. And the other question comes from myself, because in the discussion on the sort of political economy of internet, you have these discussions on producers. So we as users are also producing not only data, but also we are feeding the whole mechanisms of artificial intelligence. And at least as I remember, you don't address this in your article, and also in other chapters of the book, I didn't see this discussion. And I think in the case of pandemic, this became quite evident. Also in case of schools, that not only teachers, but also children have been producing a lot of material for the big companies. So how do you see this as an issue? And perhaps you can comment on this, and then you can close the session.
Yes, thank you for the questions. Yes, children and teachers produce a lot of data, and parents actually, because parents are also enrolled in these apps, produce a lot of data. In theory, every app has to sort of comply with certain regulations around privacy. The way that in practice, the way that these verifications are done is essentially very there's one organization that sort of audits, anyway, it's the school districts don't have the resources to do this. That's one of the things that I'm trying to research at the moment, and it's very, very difficult to get exactly a sense of what's happening. But what I'm seeing is that we don't know as much as we would want to know about how this is actually happening. And the processes whereby an app is, qualified or validated, is itself essentially self-regulation for sure. They're supposed to, say that they comply, and so therefore, because they say they're supposed to do it. And then there's this. Now we have these organizations that are developing, often non-profit organizations, to create standards. So that it's taken care of essentially by the market. Now, there's one thing that I haven't really mentioned, which is there's a lot of hopes and a lot of hype, probably a lot of unwarranted hype around the personalization of learning. Sort of this idea that, the thing that, essentially public schools, are traditionally organizations that are organized by, they feed students essentially the same thing. You have one teacher and, feeding. But with, these kind of tools, you can really meet the children exactly where they are, right? And so, say you're asking your class to do an exercise. Well, you have 30 kids in the class. You can have 30 exercises at sort of slightly different levels because, one kid reads at a very high grade level, one is very low, and so on, and everybody in between. So you can do that. And that's part of the hype of what these systems are sort of selling. But of course, that hype is itself very productive of the kind of data that you are mentioning, right? Because it is, you need to have data on each and every kid so that you can actually personalize the service, right? So, it feeds into, you're absolutely right. This is a very important aspect of, of actually creating that sort of economy of producers, right? And in terms of sort of the education as a sort of as a seller's market, and what can be done. Well, I mean, I think it's very important that that the incentives are right for companies, and that they, whatever they do it in a way that actually serves the public good, and that is, that is a very, very broad mandate and a very important one, and it shouldn't be left up to them to define what the public good is. And so that, so there needs to be regulation, there needs to be, a broad discussion incorporating the civil society, the state, everybody who's sort of affected by this one way or another. So that's my only, I think that's my only solution is sort of, more democracy and more regulation. But, I'm sorry that I don't have anything better for you.
Okay.
But I think it's good enough, Marion. Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I think it was a great experience for us that you have been with us, and it was just great listening to you. Hope it was not the last time that you are talking to a German audience, obviously. Well, I also thank, of course, all those who were responsible for setting up this event. For Valentina, my old Torres, I think, thank you very much. They helped us a lot. And thanks to Mauricio, to Sergio, and to Mariana for doing all that. And thanks for the questions and the students who asked these wonderful questions. And I hope we see each other. I think it is in 2 weeks, because next month, next Tuesday is, I think, not the way that we have a new session, but it's in 2 weeks, right, Sergio?
Yes, just for those who are in Berlin, we have a talk in presence, a lecture in presence by Jan Peters, also from the University of California, but from Santa Barbara. So, but this is only for the privileged people who are in Berlin at that time. Yeah, thank you also from my side. I couldn't imagine a better start for our lecture series. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It was really a delight to converse with all of you. And, that is the magic, right, of the great online migration right there. Berkeley, Brazil, Berlin, Hamburg. So thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you. So, bye-bye. Have a nice evening or a nice morning. I don't know.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.